Okay, time is 11 o'clock. While everyone can join in as we progress, let's get it going first this morning for our second session of our CIC webinar series. So for those of you guys who have joined us in the first session, welcome back. For those of you guys who are first timers for our webinar series, naturally welcome. We are pretty excited for this particular session, in particular because we think there's a lot more data that we have put together, and hopefully that gives you some actionable insights. Again, before I begin, please allow me to introduce myself again. My name is Ashran. I'm the CEO for Dattel, and I've got my colleague with me, Ayn, who's the regional head for client engagement. She's going to be walking us through today with what you can possibly look at business opportunities and also mitigating risk at your end. Yeah. But before we go further, please allow me to actually thank you, our corporate partners. So CIC has a few corporate partners across the 3 countries that we are currently present in Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. So thank you to Dentsu, Bridgeham Indonesia, Magic, MDAC, Marketing Mix, Media Prima Digital, Marketing Oops, and MRCA. So a little bit of a reminder for everyone before I pass on to Ayn this morning. The data that we are presenting today, or the insights that we're presenting today, comes from a couple of data points essentially. Number one, early in the year, we did a pre-COVID consumer state of mind study. And then we kind of proceeded to look at COVID-19 reimagining consumers exercise. And at the foundation of it all is data from our consumer intelligence platform, Voyager itself. And these are the 3 sources that right now we're using to actually kind of provide some insights and also hopefully some actionable insights for everyone here today. Now, the topic that we have today, the overriding topic is still reimagining consumers. And for those of you guys who are not too familiar with the philosophy of Dattel, well, most people in the market tends to start the analysis, the understanding of consumers from a demographic lens. We take from a behavioral lens, right? And that behavioral lens we think is going to be valuable for you because you are not limited by just the existing types of customers that you have, but you are able to see beyond that. And that's what we're going to walk you through today. In terms of some of the things that we're working out. And our goal essentially for today, right, is to be able to show you how you can identify opportunities and manage risk or mitigate risk during the recovery period and beyond. And for those of you guys who were in our first session, right, we started from a very broad landscape. That was the first starting point. We're looking at the consumer state of mind and what are the key markers for that. But naturally, from some of the questions that you guys have been asking, some of the engagements that we've had with some of you guys, everyone is also feeling very anxious. You want to take action, you can't wait. But again, taking action without having full visibility can be dangerous also. And one thing I'd like to highlight to audience that's in this session this morning is that sometimes what we observe may not necessarily the total reality, right? And as we were sharing with some folks prior to this session, you know, there were people asking, Ashran, but I see a lot of people doing this right now. So in our lens, we say those are very anecdotal, different pockets of behavior, something that may seem like that current behavior right now, but you've got to look at it in totality to see whether is it significant enough or not in terms of the markets itself. So today's session is actually going to be a bit more unique. Unique because we're not just here about presenting a report, right? we are going to be showing a bit of the landscape so that everyone is on the same page with regards to the consumer perspectives within the region. But we've actually chunked it into 4 key things within our methodology. So Ian's going to be looking at the landscape of consumer confidence and taking a different lens on consumer confidence than what is normally used for. And then we're going to be sharing a little about how then you can look at the state of consumer readiness, and then do some correlations with regards to behaviors during things that they do at home and the state of readiness in terms of them moving forward. And at the end, presenting you pretty much the consumer segment that you may want to look at addressing. And this segment that we're going to be presenting could either fit exactly who your existing customers are, or they actually present opportunities or sometimes shifts in terms of the segment that you are possibly dealing with at the moment. So again, as a reminder for everyone, again, how this session is going to go, Ian is going to be walking through, giving some insights, and how you want to frame as you're following through Ian's presentation is to be able to look at how can it be contextualized and walking you through each of the blocks that we have. And the Zoom naturally has the Q&A section. So please, at any point during the session, post your questions. We'll try to address them in between if we find that it's very relevant so that we don't go too far away. Or we'll try to address them at the end. Yeah. So with that, Ian, over to you. And let's see what we can share with the rest of the crowd here today.
Okay. Thanks very much, Ashran, for the introduction and the sort of recap on what we've been doing so far. So for those of you who were in our first webinar, yeah, as Ashran mentioned, it was kind of like just understanding the landscape instead of sort of setting a baseline and looking at what sentiments were like for consumers, comparing the pre-COVID sentiment and how and the sentiment of consumers as COVID really started changing their lives or changing everybody's lives. But since then, we're starting to see basically governments reopening, looking at reopening of the economy and therefore the reopening of business. And I think that is this is where a lot of consumer businesses are considering what does the reopening of the economy is going to mean for my consumer business. Am I going to survive? What do I need to do to change, or what do I need to do to ensure that I'm able to recover? So during this recovery period, basically, I think we know that things are still in a state of flux. Government announcements and policies are still being shaped, and things are still kind of very dynamic. And consumers also are still kind of playing a wait-and-see game in many activities in many industries. So it's important for businesses to recognize that there needs to be a focus on what can be done and what cannot be done, so that you can kind of target and allocate your resources in the best way, in the most strategic way possible, whether it involves in investing in the right kind of strategy, the right kind of tools, and the right kind of and the right kind of insights. And there's always the need to be agile, which means if there is a need to pivot, if there is a need to innovate to capture where the consumer is moving, then so be it. And all businesses have to be prepared for that. Same case for us as well. So the reality, if we're talking about the road to recovery, what does it look like? Probably like this. Basically, we know very little about how this recovery is going to go, because there's always that fear of a second wave or a third wave, and the inability to kind of contain the public health crisis right now. And the fact of the matter is the road is also unpaved. Nobody has gone through this before, and we all have to go through it. There are obstacles everywhere. The road is narrow. A lot of businesses are possibly going to fall by the wayside and not survive the trip. But like it or not, if you want to get to the other side, you have to take this road. We have to take this road just to get out of where we are. So that's the reality. But in order to make it as safely as possible, then we also need to assess the situation better and ask the right kind of questions. And then frame the situation where we see risk. Is there also opportunity? It's really a case of the business that has the best opportunity to survive this is a business that is able to frame what people see as risk as a possible opportunity. where people are afraid to go, maybe there is an opportunity there for you to take a certain amount of risk if you have the means to do it. So one thing when it comes to risk also means data. And in our case, of course, what we have to offer is consumer data. But the very fact is, once the pandemic hit, the value of historical consumer data has really plummeted, because now so much has changed in terms of consumer behavior that whatever consumers had done before COVID cannot be used to predict behavior after COVID. So the way we're looking at it, as we, at the core of our business is in collecting and presenting holistic consumer data through Dattel's Voyager. And the way we're kind of segmenting the data now, we're seeing that it comes in stages, when we're looking at pre-COVID data, and then data when COVID-19 comes, it hits everybody and everybody is forced into lockdown and behaviors start to change. And now we're in this phase where we're seeing recovery starting to take place. Whether that recovery is going to take a long time or it's going to be quick depends on a number of different factors. But hopefully we will be able to eventually be able to see that volatility and that state of flux start to stabilize, in which case then we can say that we've arrived at the new normal, or how things are post-COVID. So it is more crucial than ever now to really be able to ask the right questions and try to then get those answers so that you know how you want to move forward. So these are some of the questions that we are trying to find out. These changes that we're seeing, is it temporary or permanent? Are the changes during the COVID lockdown going to stay the same in recovery, or are there going to be changes in the behavior? And what factors are attributable to these changes or to these new behaviors? Are priorities going to change? Are new relationships between certain types of behaviors going to emerge? Or are there some relationships that are going to change? Can we use these emerging or new relationships to, are they strong enough for us to use them to forecast and to predict trends? So these are questions you want to ask. We have not got the answers to them yet, but we are on that journey to try and find out those answers. So we're going to try and set a baseline again in this way to try and get to these answers today for you. Now, the fact of the matter is, we are during this recovery period, as people try to kind of determine whether things can go back to normal or not, there's a high uncertainty and quite volatile uncertainty that's happening across the three countries. 60 to 80% of consumers are either unsure of how they want to move ahead with plans that they've made, whether purchase plans or even plans related to social activities, and many are just postponing. And for us, it's like postponing is basically just kicking this decision down the road. But essentially, these concerns, these uncertainties are driven mainly not just by financial health, but also concerns for public exposure. In light of COVID, whether people feel that it's safe enough for them to expose themselves physically to an environment where the risk of infection or the risk of disease spread can be high. So we do need to understand how this uncertainty is going to affect the rest of the businesses, and how consumers are then going to shift their priorities over time. So how Dattel can help is we're trying to put all this data together and really churn out those insights onto their activities and their insecurities across these different periods, and focusing right now on that recovery. As we mentioned, the recovery is always in a state of flux. So it's really important to kind of track as much as possible how the movements are changing. And hopefully with these insights, we can help businesses to determine whether it is about your acquisition objectives or your retention strategy or your communication strategy. With this data, hopefully the insights can help you to plan better, focus better, and optimize your resources in your strategy. So for today's session, what we're going to look at is basically the basic structure or the foundation of the insights that we're going to put together. So it comes in 4 sections. We're going to start with confidence score, and then we're going to touch on consumer readiness, which is kind of a measure of risk tolerance for consumers. And then the second half, when we go into correlation analysis, we're going to look at it from the perspective of a case study so that you can get a little bit better context on how we utilize this. And finally, of course, once we've done the correlation and we've seen what the opportunities are, then it's really about targeting the best group of consumers who are the most responsive or the most likely to respond to your business activities. Okay, so again, feel free to ask questions. We'll try to address them. Towards the end, later on, we'll address as many of the questions as possible. But if you have anything additional, of course, feel free to talk to our business development team as well on how we can look specifically into your business or into specific areas that are of interest to your business or your industry. Okay. So in terms of how we do this, and the reason why we are able to do this is, firstly, we have a curated consumer cohort. Essentially, we're tracking the same set of consumers week in, week out. So that helps us to be able to determine those changes and see the relationship between these changes. We are collecting data across 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. The sample size on average is about 1,200 per country, and it's nationally representative. And then we are collecting, as mentioned, on a weekly basis. Consumer behavior, some consumer behavior data is captured on a weekly basis, and consumer sentiment then is captured monthly, and we overlay them. So for the purpose of this session, we're going to show you data that spans across 9 weeks, covering months of essentially April, May, and June. Okay?
Feels like 9 months, right?
Yeah, it does feel like 9 months, doesn't it? Anyway, so we're going to start first with the confidence score. And the confidence score essentially is a measure that takes into account certain activities and plans that are impacted by COVID-19. So we don't look at everything, we only look at certain high involvement plans, and these are plans for the next 3 months. So we look at basically on a rolling basis how likely people are to make these plans and how likely they are to follow through with these plans. And these are plans that affect people on a financial basis, but also on a social basis, which is why we do have social plans and investment plans. So this is not, we can look into adding more things. In fact, some of these investment plans we just added recently into the June data. So there will, we can mix and match and add some things if there is interest from any particular business to focus on certain areas. But essentially what we're trying to understand is the reprioritization of plans and activities, especially the high involvement ones, around COVID-19. Okay, so I'm sure there will be questions about why these items. So the reason is that once COVID-19 hit and we start to experience the lockdown, it means there's less exposure, less social interaction or less physical interaction and social contact. And that means then there's more focus on the home. Focus on the home and private spaces, hence the items in the purchase plans. Social plans speak for themselves. I think it's about how willing or how ready people are to interact with other people on a small scale or larger scale. And then investment plans are more on the niche activities and whether there are groups of people who are still financially able to proceed with longer term decisions, life decisions in that sense. So we're going to cover this on a country by country basis so you can start to see how things change. But just to give you a sense of how we measure the confidence score, it really moves along 3 dimensions. So in the chart here is sort of an illustration of how the data that we're looking at. So first thing is we look at incidence rate. Essentially, how many people within the population made plans to do this activity in the next 3 months. Then the next item is the certainty of their intention, which means are they decided or are they undecided about how they want to move forward with these plans. And finally, it is about what the distribution of the certainty decisions. So are they intending to proceed with the plans or are they intending to cancel those plans? So these represent the certainty and a number, like for example, in this case, we're looking at 26% total certainty, but the uncertainty then is about 74%. Yeah, so you get that sense. But as you can see, the uncertainty levels is quite high. So let's cover Indonesia first, just to get a sense of how things are in Indonesia within these 3 months, April, May, and June. But in a sense, this also can be used as a way to kind of project what the consumer confidence looks like and give you a sense of how ready people are to follow through with those plans and therefore how confident they are in the economy bouncing back. So we don't look at the day-to-day economic confidence, consumer confidence or consumer sentiment data. It's a little bit different in the sense because this is very specific to COVID. Okay, so what we see in Indonesia, this is on the purchase plans. we see that there is in some ways a stagnation when it comes to purchase and plans for home. As you can see, the orange line here represents purchase of furniture and large home appliances, and the dark purple relates to purchase of home or renovation of home or moving home. So we're seeing that the number is just continuing to stagnate continue to decline for the home purchase. It rose for Lebaran in that sense, for when it came to furniture and large home appliances, but then it starts to stagnate in the past Lebaran, going into June. Whereas when we see digital device, so people were planning, when it came to the month of May, there were fewer plans to purchase digital devices or vehicles, but that number has rebounded in June, which meant that more people were actually making plans in the month of June compared to the month of May. So this may have a lot to do with basically allocation of funds and resources during Lebaran. But that anticipation now has helped the confidence score to rebound. When we see social activities, however, we're seeing a different pattern. We see dip in hosting as well as attending social events. So from the high of Lebaran festivities, so I think people in Indonesia were looking forward to basically, celebrating Lebaran with family and friends. So there was higher confidence and higher intent to socialize during Lebaran. However, that sentiment has since subsided and has come down when we start to see fewer plans and also increasing cancellations towards hosting as well as attending social events. Now, when we see the blue line, which represents personal travel, it seems that the confidence score is growing, and it's mainly attributed to lower cancellations. But when we look at the details of this behavior or the plans, we start to see, firstly, of course, the percentage of plans, incidence of plans have already come down between the month of May and June. But also the certainty has actually risen. From 25% of people who sort of had very firm decisions in the month of May, suddenly we're looking at only 18% who are clear about their decision towards their travel plans, which means 82% or 4 out of 5 Indonesians who made travel plans in June, between June and August for the next 3 months, starting June, are now uncertain. So the uncertainty has actually risen. So when it comes to the social activities, the uncertainty has actually gone up, despite the fact that there are certain, within the people who are certain, there are shifts in that regard. It looks positive, but the uncertainty is still very high. But when we look at the niche high involvement investment and life plans, now this group, there's about less than 5% of Indonesians who actually say that they make these types of plans. So we're talking about anywhere between, between 4 to 3% or 4 to 2%, if I'm not mistaken. So we're seeing that when it comes to weddings and engagements, there's high intent to follow through. In fact, there's high intent to follow through across all. The only thing is when it comes to the intent to get health or life insurance, the rate of incidence is low, which means few people actually make plans to purchase health insurance or life insurance. The plans for what we can see is that people who made plans to either pursue their studies or continue their studies, or people who made plans to invest in the financial market, there is a higher likelihood of them proceeding, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, is anywhere between 40% to 55%. So up to half or more than half of people who made these plans will follow through. So one thing that we can see already at this stage is we see different patterns. When it came to decisions relating to finances, there's a higher confidence or a higher certainty. People are more likely to follow through with those activities. But when it came to social activities in Indonesia, then the uncertainty is much higher. So people are having doubts about these social events and social activities. Less doubt about anything to do with finance, anything to do with investment, anything to do with short-term purchases or immediate purchases. So let's take a look then, how are things different in Malaysia? So in Malaysia, we do see, at least when it comes to purchases, the momentum seems to be growing after Aidilfitri, mainly because we start seeing that purchase plans actually started to grow for some of these activities in May. But uncertainty was also the highest in May. So when it came to June, purchase plans for some of these activities started to go up, and certainty kind of decreased a little bit. So that's something to take note of. And then, however, of course, cancellations, the gap between cancellations and intent to proceed for vehicle purchase was still very small, which means that you know, there's a lot of cancellations as well as intent to proceed. So do take note of that. When it comes to confidence score towards social activities in Malaysia, if you notice, all of it is still within the negative territory. When it's within the negative territory, it basically means cancellations still exceed intent to proceed. There are more people cancelling their plans than there are people who say, okay, I'm going to go ahead with my next 3 months plans. So we're seeing when it comes to social activities, even as Aidilfitri came and went, the incidence rates actually were coming down for all these 3 categories on a month-to-month basis. So it was highest actually in April, but far more cancellations. And then the cancellations seem to decrease, but actually uncertainty was growing as well. So while we're seeing a decrease in cancellations slowly, but the uncertainty is, it's actually shifting more towards uncertainty rather than decision to proceed. Yeah. And then finally, we're looking at the niche activities. Again, we're seeing the same pattern where niche activities have a higher inclination of proceeding. So especially when you're looking at the score of 2.43, which is for investing in financial markets, we see 10% of Malaysians actually had made plans to invest in financial markets in the next 3 months. And about 50%, half of those people still intend to proceed. So the intent to proceed for these niche activities is very high, which represents, which suggests that basically it really is more about the financial ability. So we're seeing some similar patterns, maybe at different rates across these confidence scores when we compare Malaysia and Indonesia so far. So there is that similarity in terms of the patterns. Higher certainty towards the financial decisions, purchase and investments, lower certainty towards social activities. So let's move on to Thailand. Okay, this one is really interesting because we're seeing that the momentum halted for everything except for home furniture and home appliances. So it seems that it's attributed to basically as the economy reopens and there are more sales and a lot of businesses want to clear off stock. That may be one of the reasons why people then say now is a good time to actually start thinking about purchasing items. And also because there's an increase in work from home. So there is a need to furnish the home and prepare the home and create it, make the home more conducive for a post-COVID type of lifestyle. So hence we're seeing the incidence rate actually surging from 8% to 44%. So from May, it was less than 10%, and suddenly in June it went up. 44% of Thais are planning in June, July and August to buy furniture as well as home appliances. So that's very interesting. When we look at social activities, at least social activities seem to be going up, moving upwards, although the momentum has halted. So there is caution towards social activities. In uncertainty, again, is rising, hence the momentum is slow. Basically, when it comes to attending and hosting social events, more Thais are actually becoming less certain about whether or not to continue with those plans. The incidence rate actually has just shifted by 1 or 2 percentage points up and down. So it's it's just bobbing up and down in that sense, but it's the uncertainty pattern that's still continuing to move upwards, and that's affecting the momentum. The same thing also is with the travel plans. Right now, the gap between cancellation and intent to proceed with travel plans is very small. I think maybe about 1%, if I'm not mistaken. So the uncertainty here remains high, about around 75, 76% of Thais still are uncertain or undecided about whether or not to continue with their travel plans. And finally, when we're looking at, again, we're seeing, again, the same pattern, more or less, with the exception, of course, weddings and engagements. Somehow, people have become undecided about weddings and engagement plans. So there is actually no intent to purchase, no intent to proceed, or intent to cancel. People are either postponing or just kind of like holding off on those decisions. But when it comes to those other investment plans, such as health and life insurance, financial investment and studies, then there is a much higher indication of proceeding. So again, we're seeing at least in these three aspects, that similarity. So we're seeing some similarities again, which kind of attracts across all the three countries, where we're seeing financial behavior and social behavior actually following some similar trends. So what does this mean when it comes to the confidence score and what we're seeing in the confidence score? When it comes to decisions where the consumer has control over the level of social exposure, then they have more certainty in how they want to move forward. But when there are when it comes to activities that are involving the risk of social interaction and social exposure to others, then they are less certain and less confident about making a decision.
Right. So you know, I hope while there was a lot of stuff that Ayn was sharing just now, and you know, just giving snippets to everyone with regards to the various three countries. And I know we had a question that had a specific interest with regards to Thailand. Now, for any of you guys out there, number one, who is actually interested to know a little bit more, because what we just shared with you is also a tip of the iceberg in terms of where we see and what we can present during this time. But one thing to note is that some of the things that was put as markers or variables as indicators, as we're putting across just now, under the purchases segment and the social segment and the investment segment,
yeah.
Are our markers, so that we can then look at extrapolating into other things that relates to your industry or your business itself. And these are the baseline in terms of how we see the larger consumer market itself before we then drill down further ahead. So again, like I mentioned just now, the key essence among all those data points that was presented is about consumers having the need for control on social exposure. So keep this in mind, contextualize this within your perspective of your business. And then what I will do now is actually present about consumer readiness.
Okay. All right. So when we're talking about consumer readiness here, mainly as I mentioned at the earlier in the session, we're talking about the degree of the consumer's risk tolerance towards activities outside of the home. How much risk are they willing to undertake to do the activities that they used to do pre-COVID times? So we look at a number of different activities that people may have done on a day-to-day basis, as well as some activities that people indulge on a leisurely basis or not so frequent basis, including, you know, going to events and, you know, attending or you know, going to the cinema or attending sports or concerts and things like that. So it's a spectrum of activities depending based on different levels of frequency that people indulge in. So what you can do with this risk tolerance information is basically to see how fast that business or industry will recover. So the higher the risk tolerance for people, the faster the recovery. The lower the risk tolerance, then that means that it's going to take some time for the business or the industry to come back, to get back on its feet. Because as people still prefer to hang back, then it's going to take quite a lot to convince people to start, you know, to start engaging and to start consuming within that industry itself. So just to bear that in mind. So what we looked at here is we asked the question of, it's a hypothetical question. Essentially, what would you do, how soon would you do these activities if all COVID-19 related measures are lifted tomorrow? So it's a hypothetical question to kind of assess people's level of risk tolerance at this stage. And we're comparing between two time periods now, May and June. Okay, so we're going to look at it in these, we're kind of segmenting some of these activities together. So here we're looking at transport and mobility activities, and take into account that the answers here are basically people who are ready to do these activities immediately. That's the dark green. And the lighter green is people who want to wait up to 1 month. So what's interesting here is looking at the readiness to take transport service. And we're seeing a very worrying trend here, because I can tell you that for most of the activities, we don't see this downward trend, but this is a downward trend that is very pronounced across all three countries. What this means is suddenly, even the people who were immediately ready in the month of May are now becoming hesitant about taking transport services. And this includes public transport as well as e-hailing or ride-hailing services. So take into account, this drop is happening across all the three countries. But at the same time, we look at the readiness of people to send their vehicles for a wash or service, which basically indicates how much people are using private vehicles for day-to-day use. So if they're ready to do this, then it suggests that they are intending to use their vehicle on a frequent basis. And we can see these numbers are actually quite high and still growing in Malaysia. Although, of course, one thing to take note also is the percentage of those who are waiting up to 1 month in the previous month, whether that has converted into those who are ready in the month of June. And we can see that there is some conversion, definitely in Malaysia, for example, we can say there's a 10% conversion between the month of May and June from people who were just waiting and people who are now ready. But that conversion is 10%, which is not the entirety of the group that said that they were going to wait up to 1 month, which means a lot of people are still playing the wait and see game. They're still cautious and they want to wait a little bit longer and they feel like it's okay, I can do without it for some time. So if the total of those who are ready immediately and those who are waiting up to 1 month does not go up, that means it's stagnating, which also means that the industry is not going to grow very fast. It is stable, but it is not moving and it's not growing and it's not getting that momentum anymore. It's stagnating. So it's a question of when you're looking at taking transport service, we are seeing that there is a decline, which means taking transport services, especially e-hailing and ride-hailing services, are going to be in trouble if they continue, which means they need to refocus on other aspects of the business. Whereas in this case, there is a slight upward movement, but also stagnation in some places. Like in the case of Thailand, for example, we're seeing that the totals seem to stagnate. Yeah. This may be basically when we're looking at this, what we're concluding here is that definitely there's that fear of exposure and people still prefer to either just remain at home where they are like creating their safety, private bubbles of safety, or if they need to travel, they're going to take private transport instead. So we are seeing that as the pattern here, that fear of exposure and that preference to create their own private travel or private safety bubbles and safe spaces for them to go about their lives. Now we look also on fitness and beauty activities. So again, we're seeing some pattern, some improvement in Malaysia, but take note also the levels in Malaysia is far lower than in Indonesia and Thailand. And we can see there's some stagnation in these readiness. In Indonesia, for example, the proportion of people who want to exercise or do fitness activities outdoors or at the gym seems to be relatively unchanged between the months of May and June. So this is the proportion and it's not going to go up anytime, it will take some time for it to recover. Whereas for Malaysia, it's still moving up, but it's moving up from a low base. So we don't know whether then it has already reached its reached a plateau at some point and it's going to start stagnating. We'll see in July whether the numbers continue to go up. Readiness to go to the park and playground also seems to stagnate for Indonesia and Thailand, still moving up in Malaysia, although it's starting from a low base. But going to beauty services, we're starting to see a decline overall across the three countries, not as dramatic as as transport services, but definitely we're seeing an overall decline. So, and it's more pronounced in Thailand. So what this says is there's the desire, yes, there is a desire to be more active, but that's not growing anymore for some time. But when it comes to wellness, such as, going to the hair salon or going for a massage or manicure, pedicure, this is going to be, it seems that it will be taking a hit and people are more concerned about exposing themselves through the physical touch that is required to go to a beauty service. So if you want to go for a facial, there are people who are concerned because you have to stay still in a small space and have people touch your face. So there is that concern of physical contact and the exposure risk that comes with it. Then we look on physical social activities. So we're looking at attending events, social events, whether small or big, and also eating out, because we tend to associate, social events with food, right? But when we start seeing this, we see that, okay, there is a high inclination for attending small scale social events. And we're talking about small scale here is 5 people or less. Big social events is a little bit bigger, but medium size, not more than, I think not more than 10 or 15 people. So when we're looking at this number, of course, there's a higher inclination to do small social events. People do want to be social, but people are also kind of are very cautious about it. Again, we're seeing stagnation in Indonesia and Thailand, an increase from a low base in Malaysia. But when it comes to eating out, we're seeing that readiness is not as high, which means that people who are attending small social events don't necessarily want to do them outside in restaurants and cafes. And perhaps there's a stronger inclination to do these activities in the comfort of either their own home or the homes of their family members and people that they know and are familiar with. So there's that element of control again, of personal control over what and who they're exposed to. So that has an effect on the readiness. Again, take into account that there's a lot of stagnation, and in Thailand, there's decrease in the inclination to eat out overall. Yeah. When it comes to leisure activities, so we see that there's a higher inclination and readiness. A lot of people want to go to shopping malls, and there's definitely more people who are already ready to go to shopping malls, but that base is still going to take a long time for it to actually move up. In fact, we're seeing in Indonesia a 7 percentage point decline between the months of May and June overall, and especially it's affecting those who used to want to go immediately in May. Now that's actually lessened by it's basically a quarter of that has decided they don't want to go anymore. In terms of going to entertainment centers or attending sports concerts, we can see that here, this is going to take some time before people have the confidence and readiness to actually go to these places. Entertainment centers include places like cinemas, karaoke places, arcades, and places like and entertainment centers like that. So we can see that in these closed spaces, people are less inclined or less ready or prepared to actually go out and expose themselves in a small, in a confined space for long periods of time. Whereas in a shopping mall, you can still move around, you can go in and out as and when you want to. So there is, again, that inclination. If it's a space or if it's an activity where I have control over how much exposure I am having, then I'm more prepared to do that. Now, here's the thing when it comes to travel and tourism. So when we look at this, we don't even want to touch about travel overseas, because I think at this point it's really immaterial given that borders are still closed and people are not, travel bubbles are going to take a while before before those are finalized. But at this stage, when we see domestic travel, we know that a lot of, especially for Indonesia, Thailand, and even Malaysia, there's dependency on tourism. There's high dependency on tourism. And because foreign tourism or international tourism is off the table at the moment, the government does, and a lot of hospitality businesses do depend a lot on the domestic market to be able to recover. But at this stage, we're not seeing that recovery happening anytime soon. It's stagnant, the growth is very minimal, and it is really at a low base. And mainly because of, we think it's because of 2 things. One, of course, traveling costs money. It is going to take away cash that people are trying to reserve for essentials and emergencies under these uncertain times. So that's one aspect. But the other aspect is when you travel, you're exposing yourself to multiple conditions. And there's a multiple exposure risk compared to just going to one place for a few hours and then coming back home where you can feel safe. But this is going to a place for several days and exposing yourself to risk over a longer period of time. And a lot of people don't want to take that risk if they can help it. So we're seeing this as not a good sign for domestic travel. However, when it comes to visiting tourist attractions, we're seeing a different pattern, at least for Indonesia. People are still willing to go to local tourist attractions, which means going to places that are within the city or maybe just really not too far from their home, where they can just go and come back, but without having to spend time or spend days away from home. So again, we're seeing a lot of that pattern where people just want to be close to home, close to their safety bubbles and have that level of control over the level, over how much exposure they are taking. Finally, we looked also at education, sending children to school and sending children to daycare. Now, this one is a dilemma because a lot of households with small children obviously are thinking about the safety of their children, but at the same time, in many, I think in Indonesia and Thailand, e-learning, even to a great extent, to some extent in Malaysia as well. But e-learning is not a viable option for all households. A lot of households where you've got a greater number of children, limited access to technology, e-learning is very, very difficult, and it's not a conducive environment or not a conducive solution. It's a temporary solution, and many parents would prefer to be able to send their children to school. But at the same, and for two reasons: one, for better education, and two, because they need to go out and earn a living. So there is that dilemma in that sense, and that dilemma is very obvious in Malaysia, where basically parents are still highly uncertain about sending their children to school or sending their children to daycare, really because they don't want to undertake unnecessary exposure risk towards their children. So the vulnerability of their family and the vulnerability of their children is topmost in their mind. So at this stage, we're seeing that there are some things that is important for businesses to understand. Essentially, if you have to, you've got to pivot and innovate, because the readiness conversion between May to June is not encouraging in many of these businesses, in many of these sectors. Consumers don't want to take exposure risk with a lot of activities, especially activities or businesses that involve crowds, closed spaces, and long periods of time. And what we see also, the risk tolerance is lowest among Malaysians. Malaysians are the most cautious at this point. They do not want to take chances and they do not want to expose themselves. Risk tolerance for public transport and e-hailing services across the board, across all countries, is coming down. To a lesser extent, of course, we saw just now also for beauty services, but it's very noticeable when it comes to transport services across all the three countries. We're seeing also that domestic tourism is going to suffer, and it's going to take a long time for domestic tourism to kind of get back on its feet, because people don't want to expose themselves to multiple risks, and also because it's a reprioritization of their finances, what they think would be more important for them to do with their money. And finally, when it comes to education of children, then a lot of parents are torn because there are limitations to e-learning for many households, due to poor or limited access to the kind of technology that some households and households with better socioeconomic conditions are able to address, but those with lower SECs or lower socioeconomic status would have difficulty trying to address.
Thanks, Ayn. And I'd like to just acknowledge Sandeep and Dongta for good questions that they've been asking on the chat group. I do encourage everyone else to ask questions. And in terms of whatever Ayn has presented and the key takeaway for this particular segment on consumer readiness, right? We're now trying to kind of ensure that the data points that we kind of pull together is able for you to actually assess what those consumer needs potentially are and what the potential commonalities are across, so that you can confidently look at adjusting, pivoting, or innovating what you're doing. And while the summary on the red blocks that we have on the screen here looks like it's addressing very specific sectors to some on the bottom three in particular, but just like anything else, for those of you out there that's either an ad agency or dealing with other types of business as brand owners, it's looking at these behaviors as indicators and what are the commonalities of those. So that's where we're going to move on now, in terms of looking at some of the correlations of behavior to be able to present that next step of opportunities for businesses.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ayn.
Sorry, before we go on, I just want to kind of address the question by Sandeep regarding in terms of the sample size. So we're looking at a consistent sample size more or less between the three countries. So like I mentioned, on average, we're looking at 1,200 for each country. So the sample size is actually consistent, and Malaysian response has always been good. The other thing then is also to take into account that when it comes to sentiment towards, because I think the question was whether this has anything to do with political uncertainty in the country. We do have some questions, although we don't publish them, but we do ask some questions about their sentiment towards how government has actually handled the situation. And Malaysians are the most satisfied towards how the government has been handling things, even compared to Indonesians and Thais. So we are seeing that Malaysians are far more compliant in that sense with whatever the government is advising them to do, and therefore that may actually have an effect on them being far more cautious than anybody else. So, okay, so that's just to address that question. So I hope that answers it, but if you have more, if anybody else has more, please feel free to ask. So we're going to go to the next one, which is the correlation. So this is the part.
Accelerating it a little bit, Ayn.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, what was that?
We got to look at accelerating it a little bit on a time frame.
Oh, okay, all right. So now we're going to look into the correlation, and this is where we're going to look at it as a case study format. Firstly, when we're comparing the correlation, we're really looking at those readiness data that we just looked at, the risk tolerance, and comparing it to the activities that people have been doing at home over the past 9 weeks. So these are the activities that we looked at: home activities, media consumption, and media content. There are some other activities also that we are gathering data on, but for this purpose, we're focusing on just these 3. So the example that we're going to use is about eating out in Malaysia. We shared with you already just now the readiness. So eating out is more or less about 14% who are ready and about 35% who are still waiting for the next 1 month. And what we see when we compare the correlation between the 2 months is that in May, those who are ready to go out were consuming a lot of video streaming content and mainly music content. Whereas those who are less inclined here, religious activities and religious content, and a lot of cooking content and activities. So we're seeing that there's a correlation, which means that the ones who are ready to eat out are more likely to do these media activities, and those who are prefer to stay home instead of eating out are then behaving in this way. How this matches up in June is that we're seeing there's some consistency remains, but it's just that now we're seeing a lot more of these digital entertainment activities that's associated with the readiness to eat out. Whereas there's consistency that people who spend their time at home cooking and baking and consuming cooking content do not want to go out and eat out. So the next thing that we do in this case, now we've identified the association between those who have high risk tolerance towards eating out and what they've been doing at home. We want to see those who have been doing these activities at home, in what other areas or what other activities do they look forward to, or are they ready to do besides eating out? So we've arranged all the activities that we had covered earlier and looked at this in an array. And this is where we saw the association of these behavioral markers, all the digital entertainment behaviors that we had seen in the slide before. So what we want to see is where else do we see these same behaviors? And we see that it emerges in these other 7 activities. Now, what does this mean? It means that basically people who have these digital entertainment consumption behaviors are also just as ready to go out and do these same activities. Now, does that mean that these are all the same, present the same kind of opportunity for the business, for F&B businesses? Not really. We got to look, we got to drill down a little bit more, and we got to see then which of those businesses actually have a better chance of recovering. So we've arranged them on the order of better chance and lower chance, and we see then those that have a better chance of recovering, which is on the left side here, are the aspects where consumers have more personal control. Whereas those that have less personal control then has a less chance of recovering faster, which means F&B businesses may want to find any opportunities to associate themselves with these other businesses or with these other activities, which will then help them to recover faster. So that's the whole idea here when we're looking at the shared behavioral markers and look at the association with these activities. So essentially then it's really up to the business. If you see that's the opportunity there, depending on what kind of the nature of your business and of course other variables that we will need to take into account besides consumer behavior, then you're able to focus a little bit more on then what that strategy needs to be. So once you figure that out, okay, this is what you will need to do with the businesses in question, it's a matter then of focusing on who these people are, those who are ready to do these activities and those who are still apprehensive and waiting for about 1 month. At the end of the day, you know that those who are ready immediately just require a specific, then the strategy that you're looking for is really on the communication to ensure that you get the right call to action message out to get them to patronize your business. Whereas for those who are still waiting, then you need to look at a different strategy to prepare them and convert them so that they are ready the following month. So the next bit, this is the final component, where then we are able to drill down those different segments. So for you to now know that you have your strategy, you know what you want to do with this particular group, then it's a case of who they are, where, how do you need to target them, what's their profile, so that then it's easier for you to do your communication strategy. So this is the profile, for example, for Malaysians who are ready to eat out immediately, and they are the ones who are most likely digital entertainment consumers, and you get that perspective of who you want to target, what the income, household income range is, and even the household archetypes that they live in. And then you've got a different set of consumers who are waiting. As you can see now, the proportion is a little bit different, and there's more inclination, which means those in their 40s are inclined to wait a little bit longer. And also you can see now that extended families are also the ones that are playing the wait and see game. So you kind of know that this is the group then that you need to target a little bit differently compared to the group that are ready to move out. So yeah, hopefully that kind of gives you that sense of essentially the flow of what we want to look at. First and foremost, again, just to recap this, we looked at the overall sentiment to get a sense of the confidence and how people feel about reprioritizing and where their priorities are shifting. We looked at the risk tolerance to determine how fast businesses or different industries are going to recover. And then we've looked at the case study very, very quickly to understand then how businesses can actually execute plans or actually turn these into actionable insights and what they can possibly take from all these insights and make it specific and contextualize it for your business and for your industry.
Thank you, Ain. There is a question from Kandi, but before we look at addressing that question, just to again kind of pull everyone back in terms of what has been presented. Again, like I mentioned earlier in the webinar, that our goal is to be able to share today a very structured process to be able to kind of lead you to a particular clarity of segment that you could potentially either leverage or look at risk mitigation. And you would notice that the journey that we started from behavior, yeah, and this is actually different than what we've seen normally, and why we're doing this is to be able to present that opportunity to your businesses out there. Because if we had taken from a very specific demographic just at your lens, you will only be seeing a very narrow perspective. So what Ain has presented just now is presenting, look, if this is your customer before, these are the other potential people that's currently behaving in that particular way. And that's what we are looking at trying to frame and address that to me. And whatever that we're presenting right now, right, can actually be tuned, because we can't present in every single context in this particular 1 hour session. We had to take one, which is about eating out and looking at that behavioral lens. But we can do this for any sectors that you're in. So if you're an ad agency out there that's actually looking at addressing some of your clients, we can contextualize the last 2 parts, especially for that purposes. If you're a brand owner, regardless of what kind of consumer-facing business that you're in, then we could possibly look at that too. What we have in terms of today, and what Ain has presented in terms of the data sets that we have, allows you to take that immediate action and opportunity. And we're looking at this, whatever data that we've presented and what we have right now, is good for you between the immediacy to the next 3 months max, for you to take any actions or leveraging across within the market. Anything that you're looking at something beyond, then we would need to be tracking it together so that you are able to see and make that decision with confidence in terms of that particular trend that you're seeing. Because what we want to ensure to that you avoid is to see anecdotal behaviors on the ground and make business decisions out of it, because it is very easy to do. We're all human beings to say that, hey, you know what? If this is what I'm seeing right now, this must be the case. So that's the lens that we have. So I touched about ad agencies a little bit. I touched about the brand owners, but also for governments, right? So any of you guys that's from the government sector, looking at putting policies and implementations in place to make sure that the length and period of recovery, what segments needs to be addressed most, and so forth with regards to that. So let us get back to some of the questions here. So Kandi was asking about, currently the sentiment in Indonesia is keen to return to productivity and accelerate economic recovery. Although there are concerns for safety, however, the focus has been to find ways to restart the economy by following the required safety measures. From the data provided, are there indications in such direction? I don't know whether Ayn, you've got anything to me, or?
I think this may require a little bit more detailed conversation with Kandi to just get an understanding of what you're looking for in particular. But if we're talking about the degree of safety that people are looking at, we do have some sentiment data on how people feel about exposing themselves or being out in public. Generally, really about getting whether they feel that other people are following the COVID-19 safety and health procedures, for example, and the trust in their fellow countrymen and women to follow the guidelines and the SOPs. So we do have some of those questions, but of course, if you're looking at something more specific, I think that's where we need to have a clearer conversation on what you're looking to understand.
Yeah. I think we put on the last slide, or even though there's the last question here, there's a question in terms of details of information and so forth. So that details is something that is very specific, that we look at helping businesses. So what we are putting on the table here essentially is that the information on this report, and we'll be sharing this particular presentation to everyone that has attended. But if anyone requires details in the context of their business or wants framing in terms of how we've done here this morning, specific to their business or to go detail, right? We are able to do that. All you need to do is please reach out to one of our colleagues at this email. And we will look at addressing them accordingly and try to be as specific as we can. Yeah. So last call, we're 4 minutes plus our allocated time. If there's any questions, again, I think in the chat group, you can either look at reaching out to pathfinder@dattel.asia if there's any questions, very general questions. But if you want to get insights for your business, if you want to be able to kind of drill down in terms of how we drill down just now, very specific at your lens, then please contact Chia at the email that you see on the screen at the moment. And with that, we're more than happy, just like I shared across in the first session. There are two things, naturally. If there's commonality across everyone, we will include that in the additions of the cycles that we're doing, right? But if there's something specific in terms of that relates to your organization that you want to know just for yourself, so that you can make the call, then please reach out to us. We're more than happy to be able to then kind of deep dive further and address any kind of questions that you possibly are looking out for. So with that, thanks, Ayn, for the sharing. Thank you for the crew for supporting this. And thank you for everyone in joining us this morning. Thanks, Dodon Ramli. Do connect. Suk Wen Choi, thank you too. Drop us a line. We would love to continue the conversation. Appreciate some of the challenges that you guys are having, because only when we try to fit the two together that we can actually get realities on the ground a lot better and be more confident in taking the actions, I guess. All right. Thank you. Caroline, always a pleasure listening to Ayn.
Thank you. Join us for the next webinar.
Right. Thanks again, everyone, and take care. Stay safe. Look forward to continue the conversation with everyone.